Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tuesday edition of Video Clips. And I'm going to start with a couple of announcements. We have some great stuff coming up that might interest you. The first weekend in March, we're having a boot camp on communication and problem solving, which are related to health because during this stressful time we're living in, inability to communicate and solve problems just makes everything worse. So anyway, Kylie Rohrabach, our fabulous therapist, is going to teach that class. It's a Friday night, Saturday afternoon thing. And then I'm teaching a class called HIV/AIDS at the end of the month, boot camp style, Friday night, Saturday afternoon. And the reason this might interest you is whether or not somebody who you know is affected by this, the similarities, and it involves Mr. Fauci as well, the similarities are pretty striking in terms of what happened back then and what's happened in the last year. I think you would be fascinated to hear the story. It's another one of these things that it reads like a John Grisham novel, going through these slides, only it really actually happened. And if you saw the Dallas Buyers Club, I think Matthew McConaughey was in that great movie, and it was actually about, based on a true story of AIDS patients who knew they were being killed by the treatment and actually sought help elsewhere. So anyway, I'm doing that at the end of the month. And then Kylie is teaching her very popular Letting Go of the Past workshop starting first week in March. I think it's a Wednesday at 5 o'clock and goes for 8 weeks. And I think we're all dealing with that, letting go of the past, right? I know I've had to let go of a lot of things that I was pretty attached to, and you have too. So lots of other things coming up. We have lots of classes around here, live stuff going on every week. If you want to be occupied learning about health, we can occupy you just about every day. All right, so this particular piece that I want to share with you is actually yesterday's newsletter article. And I'm not going to do the whole thing. I just want to give you a piece of it because it has to do with this question I get every day in an email, every day, 5 or 6 times. People will forward something that comes from somebody that was the report of what happened on YouTube with some doctor saying there is no such thing as the virus. It doesn't exist. And this comes up when I teach classes, even if the class is not about COVID-19. It's like, but the virus doesn't exist. So let's start with this, and then I'm going to give you some information. It would be too much to read all of it to you, but enough to maybe pique your interest. If you're not a newsletter subscriber, and after what I say, you would like to get the newsletter, email me at pamhopper@msn.com. We'll get you signed up as a subscriber and send this piece to you if you didn't get it yesterday, okay? So let's start with this. SARS-CoV-2 is a virus. It exists. It causes a disease called COVID-19. COVID-19 is a form of the flu. It has some unique features, but it's like seasonal flu. Some people become infected and don't know it because they have good immune systems. Some people get mildly sick. Some people get very sick, and some people die. Usually elderly people who are bedridden and take a lot of drugs, and people with several comorbidities. And I want to be very, very sure that I'm not misunderstood here. Every person who dies, whether it's of this or something else, is somebody's mother or brother or best friend or somebody important. All people are important. Gosh, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I didn't think people were important, right? So we want to make sure that we acknowledge death from any cause is tragic for the people involved and for the person who died. But we want to also put this into context in terms of the threat from COVID-19, okay? So an important aspect, and I want to say this about the virus does not exist and that whole group. You can find something to support anything you want to say online. Medical journals, some health professional talking about it. No relation to me, Dr. Karl Popper said many years ago, one of the things that people ought to do when they're encountering new information is assume it's false, try to prove it false, and if it survives that, then you know you might be onto something that's worth paying attention to. Instead, most people latch on to something without ever checking it out, and also kind of take the lazy way out, which is to look at things that support your point of view and not look at the contrary evidence. That's a lot of the people who scream at you and I saying that we're wrong. They're not really handing us detailed analyses that they stayed up all last night to write. They're just screaming. All right, so I want to look at some of the information that I know some people are quoting as supporting there's no such thing as a virus. All right, so a document titled CDC 2019 Novel Coronavirus Real-Time RT-PCR Diagnostic Panels posted on the FDA website right now shows that it was updated on December 1st, 2020, and it was updated several times. I think that might have been the 6th revision. The original document was dated February 4th, 2020, and this statement appears on page 31. Since no quantified virus isolates of the 2019 nCoV are currently available, assays designed for detection of the 2019 nCoV RNA were tested with characterized stocks of in vitro transcribed full-length RNA. I know that's a mouthful, but the point is, notice the statement doesn't say there's no virus. It states that at the time that the PCR tests were being developed and submitted for approval and authorization, no virus isolates were available. Now, this is obviously a problem, but the wrong issue to bring up is why we're using a test that wasn't developed at the time when the isolate was available initially, not to claim that no virus exists. Another version of the document's available on the archive, Internet Archive. It's dated July 13th. It has the same statement, appears on page 39 of that document. Now, the context in which this document was written and posted is very important. It was originally written in January 2020 after the first cases were reported in Wuhan, China. The CDC was developing its own test for the purposes of diagnosing cases. Now, CDC researchers weren't the only people developing tests or testing PCR tests. On January 23rd, 2020, a group headed by Charles Drosten published an article in Eurosurveillance claiming to have developed an RT-PCR test for SARS-CoV-2, and the test was immediately endorsed by the World Health Organization Director Tedros. There were several problems with the paper, including the fact that the group did not have SARS-CoV virus either. The researchers acknowledged this. They said, quote, "We aim to develop and deploy robust diagnostic methodology for use in public health laboratory settings without having virus material available. Instead, the group relied on theoretical sequences which were provided by a lab in China. A large group of scientists has called for the paper to be withdrawn for many, many reasons, including that conflicts of interest weren't disclosed by the authors as they should have been." Now, so far, we've got lots of scandal to talk about here, including why the tests weren't developed with the real viral material, why the WHO, the WHO, and CDC endorsed the test and put them into use so quickly, why there was such a rush to develop them in the first place. I mean, on January 23rd, 2020, there were 581 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the entire world. So what was the rush? But the real issues of this, which I discussed in my book, COVID Operation, I don't know how many of you have it. I have a copy here, which I can show to you. The real issue is all of the rest of this. Instead, people are confusing things by talking about there is no such thing. All right, so let's talk about this erroneous claim that the virus doesn't exist. So on January 7th, 2020, a team led by Professor Yongzhen Zhang of Fudan University in Shanghai identified a novel coronavirus and sequenced its genome. The team reported its work to Chinese authorities and submitted the sequence to GenBank, a genetic sequence database operated by the US National Institutes of Health that serves as a, quote, annotated collection of all publicly available DNA sequences. You can go to that website and see it. I wrote about this in the book, all right? The team also submitted an article to the journal Nature detailing its sequencing of the novel coronavirus. According to a March 26, 2020 paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine, China CDC also completed genomic sequencing of the novel coronavirus on January 7th, 2020. Again, in the book, all right? The CDC eventually did get virus isolate from a patient in Washington state, and the process of identification is described in a paper also published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And the CDC subsequently isolated and sequenced the genome of the virus, which was reported in a paper on March 11th, 2020. While the publication date is March 11th, an archive page of the CDC website states that the agency received the clinical specimen from the Washington state patient on January 20th, and by February 22nd had generated enough SARS-CoV-2 rodent culture to distribute to researchers. The original February 4th document was revised several times. Some people say that it was to cover up the fact that they didn't have any virus at the time. It really was more to expand the number of testing and devices that had been approved for use. Another gross misinterpretation of that March 11th paper, and again, I just want you to follow along with generally what I'm saying. And the reason I made this a newsletter article is I realized that you guys are going to want the references and everything else. But another gross misrepresentation is in that March 11th article in which they reported having isolated and sequenced and all that sort of thing. They tested the ability of SARS-CoV-2 to infect human cell lines, human cancer, and I think liver, and then they used monkey kidney and all this sort of thing. And it did not infect the human cancer cell lines and the other cell lines. This has nothing to do with anything. As you guys know, in vitro and should know, in vitro and in vivo research is interesting, but it doesn't tell you what happens in real life. It's a clue as to what to look into in research. It certainly did infect, I believe it infected the monkey kidney cells, but how an entire human being is impacted by something is totally different than what happens when you put cells in a petri dish. Now, this article goes on longer, and there's just only so much material you can absorb without seeing the article and the references, which I sent out yesterday in the newsletter, and you can have if you email me and ask for subscribing. I'm not sending it to non-subscribers because we just don't have time to email newsletters all the time when you guys ask for information. But in any case, if you want it, I'll send it to you. So it is clear there is a virus such as SARS-CoV-2. I mean, you can look at the genome online. The ridiculousness of this is crazy. Now, there's plenty to debate about with this whole thing. I've talked about my perspective on this and what I think the evidence shows and the lawsuits and all that kind of stuff. But my gosh, all we do is undermine our credibility when we start making crazy claims that somebody can disprove in, it doesn't take real long to figure this out if you really look into it. So in any case, how serious it is, I mean, separate issues. I just want to address the fact that the virus actually exists. All right, that's all for today. As usual, pass this on to anybody who you think would enjoy watching it, and I will be back to you tomorrow with more news.